Hi, welcome back. This is our fourth module and second unit after our first exam. So this next unit will be module 4 on the immune system and 5 on the respiratory system. And then we'll have another exam after these two units. So let's do a little bit with the immune system. Go to the lecture slides. So this is just sort of a cartoon drawing. The idea, though, good guys fighting the bad guys. Your own immune system cells fighting other cells, other pathogens that shouldn't be in your body. So we'll start this unit on the immune system with a brief introduction to the lymphatic system, which is the system of vessels that transport lymph throughout the body. So it is a vascular system made up of lymph vessels, not blood vessels. And these lymphatic vessels collect interstitial fluid that leaks out from the capillaries and that is not reabsorbed back into the venous blood. It travels through the lymph vessels, through the nodes, and is ultimately returned to the blood. But along the way, the lymph is monitored by cells of the immune system, looking for pathogens and foreign molecules that shouldn't be there. So it's the white blood cells that essentially filter the lymph. And the white blood cells are scattered throughout this lymphatic system, and before it is returned to the blood. So ultimately, the lymph returns to the blood at the subclavian veins. But we're working with lymph, not blood, that's traveling through the lymphatic vessels. So the figure on the right is just a quick introduction. There are lymph nodes that are encapsulated. Not a big deal, but we'll take a look at those. Other lymphatic tissue where there's a high concentration of leukocytes is the spleen, and then there are sort of diffuse areas scattered around the epithelium that is also involved with the lymphatic system and is associated with lymphocytes and other leukocytes. GALT just refers to gut associated lymphatic tissue or lymphoid tissue. So there's a little bit of that we can talk about in the digestive system, but the idea is that as you eat food, bacteria come in with the food. Some of it passes through your intestine, and your intestines are filled with normal bacteria. There are immune system cells that monitor what goes through the digestive system and can mount an immune response if appropriate antigens are present in the food. Bone marrow is the site of red and most blood cell formation. We've already taken a look at that. And there are lymph vessels that we'll look at. The thymus is an important lymphoid tissue, and the thymus is in the mediastinum. It overlays the heart, sort of embedded within the pericardial membranes. And the thymus is where T lymphocytes mature. So lymphocytes all begin their development in the bone marrow, but then they circulate in the blood that we'll get to, and they ultimately mature in the thymus. And the thymus atrophies with age. So it's most active in young children, adolescents, as their immune system is beginning to recognize pathogens out in the world. Tonsils, part of the lymphatic system also. It's diffuse tissue, sort of forms a ring around the oral cavity. This slide shows a couple of things. The drainage patterns of lymph in the body are not symmetrical. So the right upper quadrant, as shown in purple, collects lymph from those areas of the body above the diaphragm and the right side of the upper trunk and the upper extremity. All of that lymph flows into, it returns ultimately to the venous blood at the right lymphatic duct. So that merges with the subclavian vein about where that merges with the right internal jugular vein. So where those two merge is where the right lymphatic duct returns to the venous blood. So the lymph draining from that region returns to the venous blood at that site. On the left side of the body, the other remaining 3/4, if you will, both legs, all of the abdomen, and the left upper extremity, left chest, left side of the head, all of that drains into the thoracic duct. Again, it merges where the left subclavian vein and the left internal jugular vein merge. So this is the thoracic duct for 3/4 of the body, all of the left side plus the right leg and all of the abdomen. There's a thoracic duct, and there's a swelling in the lower thoracic cavity called the cisterna chyli. Cisterna is just sink, basin. It's a large swelling in the lymphatic tissue, sort of a collection point. I'm not going to make a big deal of it. I'm just pointing it out so that you sort of recognize it. If you see it, it's associated with the thoracic duct. So the two ducts you need to keep track of are the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct for drainage of lymph from those regions of the body. And this illustration gets back to the idea of capillary exchange that we looked at earlier. And that idea you should be fairly familiar with it. Again, blood enters the capillary at the arteriole, and it's filtered out at the arterial end by hydrostatic pressure. Most of that fluid is then reabsorbed at the venual end of the capillary by osmotic pressure and then is returned to the blood. So the liquid from the arterial side wanders around as interstitial fluid briefly and then is reabsorbed back into the venous side of the circulation, and that's how we do exchange with the tissues. Some of that fluid, not all of it, but a small fraction of it, does not get reabsorbed into the venous blood and stays out in the interstitial spaces and is then absorbed by the lymphatic system. So the lower right portion of this figure shows sort of a blind end of a lymphatic capillary. There are tiny little valves in the lymphatic system, that in the lymph vessels, that allows lymph to enter from the interstitial fluid. So if this is the ISF, some of that interstitial fluid is then able to enter through those flaps, and at that point we call it lymph. So it's the same fluid, but it just goes through a name change. And the upper left figure is basically showing the same idea. After the fluid is absorbed into the lymphatic vessels, it travels through the lymphatic vessels. There are little valves that look like these little nodes along the way. They're just swellings. So it's similar to the veins in the venous circulation to prevent backflow. So it assures that lymph flows in one direction only. Multiple lymphatic vessels flow into a lymph node. So you have multiple afferent vessels entering, typically one efferent exiting, and it just continues on through this system, one node through another, and ultimately it returns to the venous blood from which the fluid originally came. So the idea, if you will, if you want to draw this out or just make a quick little conceptual map, flow chart of it, if we start with the plasma, fluid portion of the blood leaks out and then circulates as interstitial fluid, and then is picked up into the lymphatic system. At that point, we refer to it as lymph, and then we go back to the venous side. So we just have venous return, venous blood, and then we're back into the plasma. So the fluid just goes round and round throughout the body, circulating through the interstitial fluid. But the important thing is that along the way, that lymph, as it flows through this lymphatic system, is monitored by the immune system. Primarily the leukocytes. The next figure is just looking at the role of the lymph system and implications with cancer. So scattered throughout the body here are lymph nodes, and they're connected by lymph vessels. There are deep lymph nodes and there are superficial lymph nodes. They tend to congregate in the axillary region, in the neck, and abdomen, inguinal region, basically where the appendage is attached to the trunk of the body. But they're scattered throughout the body. And the idea in this figure is that when a cancer forms, uncontrolled cell growth, the tumor forms, and it's small. At this point, the cells are multiplying out of control through mitosis, and some of those will metastasize and wind up trapped in these lymph nodes. So the idea of a sentinel lymph node, the idea is that these are the lymph nodes that are closest to the tumor. So these are the lymph nodes that will first detect tumor cells and may become swollen and enlarged as the tumor cells collect in the lymph nodes, which we'll take a look at in the next slide. But that's the idea of the sentinel lymph nodes. If you find the lymph nodes that are cancerous and they're the ones closest to the tumor, you've kind of narrowed down where the tumor is. So the next slide just explores this a little bit more. I thought it would be worthwhile to kind of consider some of the changes that happen with cancer and involvement of the lymphatic system. So metastasis is just spread. If a cancer has metastasized, the cancer cells have broken off from the original tumor and are now traveling through the body. Well, one of the ways that cancer cells can travel through the body is to get into the lymph system. And so on the left, in sort of panel A, is just the normal flow of the blood. So out here is the ISF, and these are lymphatic capillaries that we were looking at before. I'll just abbreviate lymph caps. And the lymph fluid normally flows through the lymph vessels, flows through the lymph node, and in the lymph node, again, there are leukocytes. And LN here is referring to lymph node. So that's the normal picture. And they flow through other lymphatic nodes and ultimately drains through, in this example, through the thoracic lymphatic duct and then to the subclavian vein. So then we're back into the systemic circulation. Something else to just note, it's not a big deal. I probably won't be doing a lot of this on a quiz or an exam, but just be aware that there is smooth muscle. That's associated with the lymphatic ducts. And in this case, it's somewhat constricted. It sort of regulates the flow through the lymphatic system. And the little X's as drawn, they're sort of semi-contracted. Okay, that's normal. In B, a cancer has started to form, and the gold cells are the cancer cells in this drawing. Remember that these are your body cells that have lost mitotic control, and they're growing continuously, either slow or fast. But as this mass of tissue develops, changes occur. One of the things that occurs is that the lymph system is modified in a sense to spread the cancer cells. So what happens is that as the cancer develops in this area, there are signaling molecules, different growth factors. GF is typically an abbreviation for some type of growth factor. We're not going to worry about the particular chemicals here, but they are produced in the tumor. And the other players here are macrophages. So they're recruited to the site. There's trouble in the area. Macrophages are recruited in part by the chemicals that are released from these cells. But the point of the figure is that the lymphatic system is modified. So it increases the lymphatic flow through this lymphatic system. Increased lymph flow, and it drains through the lymph nodes, and here the smooth muscle cells are relaxed. And that also facilitates flow through this lymphatic system and makes it easier for cancer cells to spread through the lymph system. On the left, or excuse me, on the far right, the cancer cell, or the tumor has developed larger, more signal molecules. A couple of things to note is that we now have new blood vessels that have formed. And this is a vein. They haven't drawn the artery, but let's just refer to this as angiogenesis. Which is the creation of new blood flow. And this is flowing back through our vein, so this would be our venous return back to the heart at the bottom. What they haven't drawn, but you could put in if you wanted to, just to get the idea in, you would have an arterial blood supply also that develops. So increased blood flow to the tumor to feed the tumor cells. And as the lymph vessels dilate and facilitate flow, some of the cells now break off of the tumor and they metastasize. And then they flow into another lymph node, distal to the site of the tumor. And this perhaps is one of the sentinel lymph nodes closest to the tumor. The cancer cells develop in the lymph system. The lymph node may swell as the tumor starts to develop in that lymph node. The smooth muscle cells have rearranged themselves again to facilitate increased lymph flow, and then we can wind up with more cancer cells. So, just some thoughts to be aware of with the spread of cancer and the involvement of the lymph system. And that's enough of that for right now. The next lecture we'll talk about some basic functions of the immune system, some basic pathologies, and then an introduction to the innate or non-specific immunity. So we'll pick that up shortly.